Hi, I'm John,
I'm Brian.
and we're here to critique the movie The Finest Hours about the Coast Guard rescue in 1952 out of Chatham, Massachusetts. Brian?
I was a BM2 in the United States Coast Guard from 2007 till about 3 months ago in 2015. I served in Montauk, New York, and I did a tour in the Middle East and also at Station Fort Lauderdale.
And I'm John Wampler. I was an MK3 in the United States Coast Guard from 1973 to 1977. I served on deep water Coast Guard vessels. First served on a light ship off the Columbia River, and that'll be significant when we start talking about the movie. And then I served on a 378-foot Coast Guard cutter between Southeast Asia and Alaska. And then finally worked on a buoy tender out of the Gulf of Mexico.
Overall, I thought it was a really good movie. You're going to have your Hollywood love story, to keep the plot thickened, but I thought it was a good movie.
I thought the movie was Disney-esque. There were a few items in the movie that, for my own entertainment, was kind of long in the tooth. But the rescue sequences were spot-on accurate.
Yeah, some of the things I really identified with from being at a heavy weather station was, in the North Atlantic, was the boat handling, the appropriate throttle controls, hitting the waves a certain way. So you're absolutely right. I mean, when it comes down to how it actually goes when you're out there, I agree with most of it.
Some of the boat handling that I have learned and I've utilized in my career in yachting, I learned out of the Cape Disappointment Station out in Washington State, where the National Motor Lifeboat School is. Judging wave actions, using reverse when you're surfing down waves, angle on the waves. As a seaman on the Columbia River Lightship, I actually had to ride those 44-foot whaleboats out to the lightship to go on and off station. And the instructors at the school took great pleasure in giving us the roughest ride that we've ever experienced.
Always. That was a good time. Well, there's really not many other movies specifically about the Coast Guard. The Coast Guard appears in a lot of movies, but the only one that comes to mind is, of course, The Guardian. That came out about a year before I joined the Coast Guard, and it is so inaccurate and so just see an action kutcher in a tight shirt. But then again, everyone I joined the Coast Guard with all wanted to be rescue swimmers, so I guess it did its part in recruiting for the Coast Guard. But as a whole, that was completely inaccurate. This movie was far more accurate for the real depiction of the Coast Guard.
I have to agree with Brian's view on The Guardian. Ashton Kutcher, could we put him in a smaller shirt? All the ooh-rah and pop and jump and all this other stuff, I'm sure, is pretty new today in the Coast Guard. When I was in the Coast Guard, we were just rough and tumble, all about SAR. You have to go out, you don't have to come back. Things have changed a bit since then.
That is absolutely true. So a lot of people didn't know, but the 110-foot ships that a lot of you yachters might see sitting 10, 15 miles offshore off of Florida that are patrolling back and forth, our cutters, the 110s, were just replaced recently by a new class of cutter called the Fast Response Cutters. They're 154 feet. The first one was delivered to Miami about 3 years ago. I want to say February of 2012, I think it was. And it was actually named the Bernard C. Weber. That class of cutters that are named after enlisted heroes. And the very first one was named after Bernie Weber, who is what this whole movie's about.
Yeah, it's a true story that took place in 1952 out of Chatham, Massachusetts. When I went through basic training in Alameda, California in 1973, it was only about 21 years after this incident happened, so it was still pretty current news in the Coast Guard circle. So when we were doing training for small boat operations and life-saving, a lot of what we learned came from this experience. A couple of the items in the movie that, were Disney-esque. The female lead in the movie, Miriam, was depicted as his girlfriend slash fiance. In fact, Weber was married to Miriam, and she was homesick when this whole thing happened. So the whole car accident in the ditch in the snow, and her storming the Coast Guard station, demanding that the chief, call her fiance back, is all hokey. And also Tiny, the ship's cook on the Pendleton, he was actually the last one to come off the boat, and he got swept off the Jacob's ladder in the storm and was drifted back towards the big propellers of the Pendleton, and he was actually holding on to it when Weber brought in the 36 boat, and a wave caught that boat and surfed it in, and they actually, unfortunately, crushed Tiny between the ship and the 36-footer. So Weber really, really was affected by that incident in the rescue.
I would absolutely see it again. We didn't know at the time, but it's actually available in 3D. So the way they did the ocean and the rough seas in the middle of the night, definitely worth a view in 3D.
I agree. I think 3D would pretty be exciting for this thing, especially on the Pendleton. I think that whole aspect of them in the engine room on that ship and the aft section of the ship floating it and making it work and moving the rudder back and forth and whatnot, I think that would be stunning in 3D, as well as, the guys getting pitched out of the front of the boat and landing in the back of the boat. I think that would probably be pretty cool in 3D as well.
Well, in conclusion, guys, a good movie, good flick. I would recommend going to see it and having an appreciation for what the Coast Guard used to do back before all these new modern electronics, and they had a radio and a compass back then, and that was pretty amazing what they could do.
And sometimes they didn't even have that. In this instance, the compass was swept away early on in the rescue when they were crossing the bar, and the radios in those days were not the best in the world, not like the solid state stuff we have today. All in all, I give the movie 3 life rings out of 5. Where are you at?
I'd have to agree with you.
Yeah. And thank you very much for checking us out here. Please go see the movie, and Semper Paratus. You should be listening to this while you look on this.
Did you put on Irish sheet changes?
No.
I saw